Hey, everybody out there. We are working with the rock star of Google Semantic Search. His name is David Amerland, and we're doing an MBA Marketing Strategy series, and we're talking about the Google Semantic Search and the Google Plus connection with a John Brown University show, and it's being run today by Jim Schenkel. So, Jim, tell us what's going on.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you guys coming to John Brown University, Rogers campus here in Northwest Arkansas. It's great to have David here, and it's a pretty miraculous thing that he is here. Ronnie, we appreciate your being here as well. Ronnie joined us last week in class to talk about this unique tool, Hangouts and Hangouts on Air, and how we can utilize that in our marketing efforts. So we've got a class that's watching from another room that are taking MBA marketing strategies. John Brown University has been around for 90 years. It is located in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. In 2013, it was awarded the #1 U.S. News and World Report Southern Regional College. So it's a prestigious Christian-based school, private school. Recently also, we were named the Donald G. Soderquist College of Business. Mr. Soderquist was the Chief Executive Officer of Walmart for quite a number of years. So he worked with Sam Walton. Typically, the students here are going to be from the local companies. We have 3 large companies located in the area about 5 minutes from here. J.B. Hunt Transportation, that's a Fortune 500 company. Probably another 15 minutes down the road is Tyson Foods, which is a Fortune 100 company. A little bit further down there is in Fayetteville is the University of Arkansas. And then north of us is Fortune 1, we like to call it, which is Walmart. But we've also got a unique thing. This is very much an international community. I grew up in South Arkansas, and this is quite different from what I grew up in. We have, because of Walmart, we have probably 1,200 or more vendor teams, supplier teams they call them here. And what they do is they service the Walmart account. The largest team is Procter & Gamble, which has about 200 people. So it ranges from one person all the way up. So from those companies, all those companies are our students. We've got a good group, got a good school, good faculty. I was happy about 4 years ago to be named an adjunct lecturer, and I focus on marketing strategies as well as in the spring I'm going to be doing a designing strategies. We were the first MBA program and the second university in the world, the first MBA program to adopt his book, Google Semantic Search. And I'm glad to be able to do that because, as the dean told me the other day, a lot of times these textbooks are out of date, and with everything moving as quickly as they can, you can't have a textbook that's 2-3 years out of date, even when they're published. So having David's book in the class and discussing that just makes all the difference in the world, and it shows. You'll see some comments and questions coming in from the students. They know their stuff, they're smart, they're older, they really apply themselves. So they're gonna enjoy this session tonight. Turn it over to you to address how Google Semantic Search, what it is, a little bit of that, but how it affects MBA students' employers, affects their careers, how it affects them personally, and then both the students and for baby boomers. So that's a little bit to bite off. You think we can handle that in an hour?
Thank you, Jim, and I'm delighted to be here actually, and very much this is a lot of the stuff which I do all year round in terms of helping large corporations get their executive teams right up to speed. So this is very much the audience, funnily enough, which I had in mind when I was writing the book, and I structured it in a way that is very accessible, precisely because a semantic search from a technical point of view is extremely complicated. We usually say search is not rocket science. Well, semantic search is very close to rocket science, but it doesn't really concern us because its effects are very accessible. And it is probably the biggest disrupt we have faced in terms of marketing and how we operate since the Industrial Revolution. And I say this with quite a very studied approach because the Industrial Revolution was the point where we began to scale things up and create the transactional approach, which has led us for the last 200 years. And before that, everything was very small and personable and worked around or evolved around relationships, which allowed us to examine the value of any kind of transactional kind of relationship we entered into. So we had personal relationships sort of being the bedrock of transactional ones. The world grew big and it became complicated. And we created very complicated structures to be able to operate in that. And those structures were driven by processes, because processes is how companies work. And those processes were broken down into very specific steps, because this is how we control them. And this is how we basically make sure that they work for us and do what we expect them to do. And then with the 21st century, we got into a world which is too complicated and too big, and at the same time really connected. And that created a disrupt in its own right. When you have a world which is so big, what you get is essentially noise. And you get so much noise that it drowns out any kind of signal. This is a paradox, because essentially every bit of noise potentially is a signal. And what do I mean by that? Suppose we all started talking at the same time, and we are 30 people in a room, and somebody watching those 30 people sees a lot of noise and no signal at all. Yet, if we're only talking to 3 people next to us, within that large sound which nobody can make head or tail out of, those 3 people can actually connect, and they can create a conversation despite the fact that they're surrounded by noise. So this is the paradox of the party room, where you can actually have a kind of a conversation in a very crowded and loud environment. Now suppose we scale that across the world, and the way we do that, of course, is with search, which means search has to work differently. It has to allow us to create our own signals from the noise which surrounds the big data solution or the big data problem that floats everywhere. And that, in a nutshell, is the outline of how semantic search came to be the force that it is today, and why it actually became a necessity in many ways in the way we operate.
When you're on the web or you're on Gmail, it's being analyzed from a semantic standpoint. It doesn't mean they're watching you at all, like NSA. It's not that. When I search my next door neighbor the same terms, if he used the same terms, we get different results on the first page.
Exactly, and actually I'm very glad you brought this point up, because this again goes back to the party analogy. You know, you have 30 people in the room, they're all talking at the same time. To an outsider, there's absolutely a lot of noise, but to the small groups within the group, the tangential points of contact when you're talking to 2 or 3 people make perfect sense. And if you're to move around and leave one group of people and join another one, then you join that conversation and that becomes meaningful for you. But before you joined it, it was just noise surrounding you. It works on 3 levels. The first level is the web itself, which is a web of data, and it indexes that web in a very complicated and complex way. The second level is your own personal signals. So it basically, as you say, scans everything you do pretty much on the web, and tries to understand who you are digitally. It tries to see what your preferences are, what your search patterns are, what your connections are, trying to understand your profile. And then it brings those 2 together at the point of contact, which is the search box. And at the search box, it tries to look not at just the words which you have typed in there, which in the past were very keyword driven and they were very cut and dry, and search didn't really understand them. It statistically analyzed them and gave us a statistically accurate solution to what we actually were looking for. But now it tries to understand them in terms of what you have asked, and then in terms of the intent of what you want to actually find. And those 3 things come together almost like a sandwich. And when they work exceedingly well, which is why you get constantly personalized results.
The thing I'm wondering about is what's going on with the people who are being disrupted? What's happening with the big companies? How are they adjusting to it now? Are they? And small businesses, are they? Talk a little bit about what's happening to the traditional way that it's going on, and then where you see things going over the next year or so as this begins to really go through the economy with G+ supporting Google Semantic Search.
The internet or the web basically started around 95 and started taking off. And there was a lot of excitement at the time. It was excitement because we felt the world was being connected, and in a way it was, but not quite well enough. And we also felt that there was a certain opportunity in terms of lowering costs and broadening vistas, which from a commerce point of view is absolutely fantastic, because you can market to a lot more people a lot more effectively. Also for smaller operators, it was great because they thought the web is a great leveler. Somebody with a great idea, a great product perhaps, and a great website could be almost as good as a large corporation with deeper pockets and bigger manpower. A few years on now, we know that this is not quite the case, because essentially all the corporations are a lot slower to react. They have better processes, and they have a methodology which ensures that they trial things, they put them into place, and they get the job done in a more efficient way. And consistency is one of their greatest strengths. until now. Things have changed. And why have they changed? They've changed very radically, because essentially what's happened now, we have, from a technological point of view, the nuanced approach and the tools necessary to actually work on the web as personably and as closely with people as we did offline. And like corporations were not very good at coming to the village square in the pre-industrial revolution world and trying to sell something, why weren't they very good at this? Because they were strangers and they had a strange approach. And they weren't from around here. They created instant mistrust. And the moment they tried to tell us how good they were, we felt they were pushing a lot harder than they should, and we mistrusted them even more. And if this rings a bell, well, here we are. We've got to the situation where the traditional forms of advertising, which is the hard sell of the corporation, which is the way traditionally it has created trust, found its audience, and connected with them, don't work anymore. They don't work as well. And the reason they don't work is because that audience now is a lot more resistant to the hard sell, is a lot more resistant to the slickness of the packaged approach, and wants basically to either get recommendations through networks and friends, or wants to connect with any kind of corporation at the same level as they would with networks of friends, which means that they need to have a clear identity of who is it who does the selling and why, what's their shared value, and how can they sort of work together to complete the transaction. This is really radical because corporations are not really geared to work like this. When you run any kind of corporation where you have managers and managerial structures and processes and reports and teams and people being accountable, and then shareholders who actually expect to see reports which show them a profit and loss balance sheet, personality and shared values with potential customers don't really come into this very easily. But they really have to, because this is the way you connect with your audience. And this is a challenge which, funnily enough, is the same whether you're a small operator or a large conglomerate running tens of thousands of people across the world. The good news, and there is good news in this, is that there are practical things we can actually do to help implement processes which create a kind of personality. The bad news of that is that it's disruptive. You need to sort of embrace change and start rolling with it.
The world changes. Every day, new technology comes on, new relationships come on, competition. When I was in business school 35 years ago, there was one course on international business. And today, everybody has to think about that because our competition's everywhere.
As a matter of fact, you're quite right. We have had change now at a corporate stroke large business level since the early to mid 80s, and it hasn't really slowed down at all. So theoretically, we should be able to embrace this change a lot easier. The fact that we can't or we don't indicates how disruptive it is, and it is really disruptive, because what has happened really is the customer, or the traditional customer, the traditional audience that a traditional business is actually chasing, has now moved. And in order for that business now to actually target it more effectively, it needs to evolve with that customer, with that audience. It needs to be as agile, it needs to be as personal, it needs to be as personable. And that's the hard bit, because it has to change internally. And internally, we know that corporations have always had the departments, and those departments come with teams, and those teams come with managers, and everybody comes with careers and turfs and looking out for your job first, which is perfectly understandable. This is no way any kind of judgment on this. It's exactly the way we operate because it has always worked. And now we need to break down those barriers, and we need to start talking to each other within the organization itself. And it's difficult because you need to put your cards on the table. You need to sort of start thinking less about agendas and more about shared goals within the organization. You need to start creating the kind of cognitive surplus within the organization that exists outside it. And what do I mean by that? When I make a purchasing decision, for instance, I have two choices. I can go down the path where I do my research. I sort of think that I know what I need, and then I go ahead and purchase it. And that's me working on my own. Or I can tap into the cognitive surplus of my social network. I can ask you, for example, if I know you, and you can recommend somebody else to me who will probably recommend me to somebody else, and they'll say, hey, what you're thinking of buying, I've already bought. and it's not as great as they say, for instance. Or they may conversely say, hey, you know, it's the best thing since sliced bread. Buy it, no questions asked. But either way, the point is that I don't make that purchasing decision in an uninformed way based only on my own judgment. And that's the big difference. So if you're trying to sell that to me now, and you're trying to sell it to me as you, only on your own, and you're the only person responsible for selling in your organization, you're facing a really difficult task, because your organization will traditionally arm you with very specific ways of selling, because this is what organizations do. They'll tell you, these are the selling points, this is the packaging, this is the price point, and perhaps you can give a discount up to this point and no further. You come towards me now thinking that, okay, you're going to catch my attention with the packaging, give me the price point, and if I sort of sit on the fence a little bit, you can basically give me the discount and close the sale. And this doesn't work anymore, because this is not what I want to hear. So essentially, you need to be able to network inside your organization the same way. You need to have input from your sales team, the PR team, perhaps the production people. You need to know about potential problems. And if you have all that knowledge and you're armed with all those things, then you become a lot better at it.
About a month ago, I went up to my 35th reunion, and I carried your book all over that weekend. And I went to one session that was about Facebook and Google and Amazon and LinkedIn and who's going to be the winners in the future. And never once did they mention anything about semantic search. And I talked to the professors afterwards, and they didn't know anything about it. It was surprising that it's not being taught. I mean, I feel proud, because that's probably the wrong word, but the fact that we're able to be ahead of what some people consider one of the top business schools, to be in this market. So do you find that in the corporate world, the top people are just simply not ready to accept this yet? Is it just the fact that it's going to have to come up from the bottom?
Inevitably, change happens. And it happens not because it is nice to happen, it happens because it has to happen. The market is moving, it is shifting, customers and the target audience are moving with it a lot faster because they're individuals, and businesses are following suit. It is encouraging, and you are one of the bright lights basically of this change. It is encouraging that the businesses are beginning to understand that they need to grasp what is necessary now and how then they can go back into their own work environments and start to implement it.
2 months ago, when you and I met online, I mean, you were great about responding to comments. You had 22,000 followers. 2 weeks later, it went to the 150,000 people plus. I don't see that those followers are coming from traditional businesses. I suspect it's coming from the SEO community that's trying to understand more about what's going on.
Semantic search in many ways is very disruptive. It's disruptive to its own industry when it comes to SEOs, and it's disruptive to marketing when it comes to marketing organizations. And in many ways, it's also disruptive to the audience, the traditional customer or consumer, because now they also connect with their research and what they find and information they find and the products they find in an entirely different way. When such profound disruption happens anywhere, the first instinct is to deny it. And you deny it because you have the luxury of seeing change happen, which you don't really understand. And your first instinct in that is to simply do what you do, but only more so. And I see this pretty much across the entire conglomerate industry in terms of the businesses which operate. I even see it in terms of smaller SEO studios who now think, okay, they need to do something different in terms of the semantic web. They need to connect with their customers in a different way and help those businesses understand a change which they haven't clearly understood themselves, because they now need to change their traditional practices. And this is a difficult pill to swallow, because they need to go back to their customers and say, what we've been doing up to now no longer works. We're going to do something entirely different, and it's going to cost you so much more because it entails more work in the first instance. This is a hard message to actually get across. And the moment you realize how difficult it is, there's always a little bit of a reaction against it. At this point, perhaps I can explain a couple of points about semantic search. And one of the things which it does in terms of creating personal relationships, we have already seen how the customers using their own personal networks to find recommendations. But one of the things which Google has made a big play on is that semantic search is going from websites to people. And this is sometimes very difficult to understand because we still use websites to find information. We use websites to complete transactions on, and we use websites to actually buy products from. So on the surface of it, nothing has changed, but actually a lot has changed because those websites wouldn't do any business or wouldn't come up in search, or the information wouldn't be as valid in terms of how we appraise it if they didn't come through a recommendation, or a sharing, an interaction, or an engagement in a social network. And Google Plus is an example, but obviously you can get a similar effect through Twitter and Facebook, or any combination of these three. So essentially, when it comes to, let's say, what you think on the practical side, what is it that I need to do in order to help my business in the semantic web? The main thing which you have to do there is actually create the kind of social footprint which allows your business to surface in a social environment, being personable first. So essentially, you need to go back on the drawing board and basically think, what are the values which got me into business in the first place? What am I known for best? How do I get those things across in terms of content, outreach, even advertising to my target audience? And then how do I measure the effect? Now, these are traditional business practices. So all that needs to change is an awareness of how you begin to create or identify the business identity which you already have, and then use content, use social engagement on the web, use interaction again on the web to get that across, find your audience, drive it to your business place on the web, and essentially complete the transaction. So this is the path which makes the transition complete from websites to people, because now it's people first, and that's where you start, and you complete things on your website. So this is the big change.
One of the things that I found so fascinating from my own perspective is I've never cared at all for Facebook. It just, it left me kind of cold. I couldn't, maybe I don't have any friends, so I wasn't able to get anybody. But that's what's been really interesting about Google Plus. I thought it would be the same thing as social media, and I heard a really good comment, a good term that was used in a program you were in earlier today, which is Google Plus is not social media. It's the social level. I think the terminology.
Social layer. It's a social layer.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this is a significant difference, because we think of a traditional social network as the digital equivalent of a friendship, real world, small circle of friends in real life, and it does. I mean, Google Plus doesn't work that way. Facebook does, because normally you go on Facebook to find the friends that you have in real life and connect with them, or even reconnect with them if you knew them in the past. But that doesn't actually, if you think about it, significantly broaden your world. And essentially, one of the big powerful effects of the semantic web and of the digital interaction is that it broadens your horizon to the point that you actually tap into this cognitive surplus, which I spoke about earlier. It makes you smarter, more capable, able to be more productive, and able to achieve more in a shorter time. And this is the addictive quality of it. And
exactly, it really is.
And essentially, Google Plus has all those tools that allow you to do that. And if we forget for a minute that we're talking about commerce and business, and if we just take a purely informational approach, if you think to yourself, okay, I know nothing about marketing, and I need to learn, and I give myself 2 months to do so. Normally, that's a really tall order. But you go into Google Plus, and not only will you find the information that you need, but you'll also get immediate access to experts who are perfectly willing to give you time and expertise, which in the past would have cost money, and actually help you along in your journey. So they create a shortcut which you wouldn't have got anywhere else. And now you're going to say, okay, if they do that, what's the value to them? Well, here's what it is. By doing that as an expert, you increase your own reputational status. So essentially, there's a hidden capital, let's call it reputational capital, which works for the expert. At the same time, you create a point of contact with a potential marketer. So if you get a brand new person who wants to become a marketer and they got that knowledge and they create their own social network, now they have power and weight of their own and they're connected with the expert. So suddenly this kind of balance of power allows both of them to gain in different ways, but mutually. And that is the true power of a social layer. Essentially, a social layer allows things to be tied together across the web in a mutually balanced way. And this is new. We never had that before.
I see an interesting parallel because, for example, Google Plus, by the traditional world, is still not even something that's worth paying attention to by many people, right? I don't know.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's still early days. Absolutely.
Okay.
I agree with that.
And for some, semantic search is also something that just doesn't make sense. Why should I even care? And isn't it interesting how those that basically poo-poo, if that's the expression I could use, the concept of Google
it's a
Plus
technical term, right?
yeah, having any value, it's not worth it, it's not worth your time, nobody's there, right? That's the funny thing that they'll say.
Yeah.
And they need to defend their decision to say that, and so they'll double down. Like you were saying, some organizations that aren't interested in learning about semantic search because it wasn't invented here or it's something different, and so they continue to do what they've been doing before. Can you talk a little bit to the parallel of what Google Plus and semantic search and how they're sort of both happening regardless, but people want to ignore it?
Absolutely. I mean, as a matter of fact, if we go back a little bit earlier to the early days of the internet, there's another parallel there where a lot of companies were resisting going online for any kind of reasons. First of all, they said, we are local. We don't want to market globally. Or they would go the other way. We are global. We don't want to market locally. Who's going to trust the web with their transactional details and their credit cards? All these objections came up, and we had the same sort of bell curve of adoption where a lot of companies resisted going online until it became inevitable. And the moment it became inevitable, you got this sort of wholesale transfer of all their businesses willy-nilly, without much thinking, online, thinking it was going to actually solve everything, and it doesn't. You really need to think about it. So that's the sort of parallel with the past. And now if we look at, quite rightly identified that both semantic search and Google Plus seem to be a minority in terms of awareness, and that's true because we're still at a very early adopter level. And what this does really is it allows those who come into it early on to take advantage of the opportunities to create the kind of processes that will help them in the long term. And those who get left behind thinking, okay, it's not for us, or it's got nothing to do with us, when it becomes inevitable, they're going to, again, come into it willy-nilly, trip up, make all sorts of mistakes, and then try to fix it and actually move forward. Google Plus, as a social layer, is an intrinsic part of semantic search. And why do I say that? Well, because essentially semantic search is about, and to get a little bit technical, is about entities. And entities here is understanding people and things as people and things, not just coded words. It's about ontology, and the ontology here is the relationship between entities. And the social layer allows Google search to basically mine those relationships, to understand how they connect, to understand how the relational values go. And it does this automatically in many ways. If you give a machine a set of data and it basically starts to sorting through the data based on a program which allows it to cluster things together according to similarities, 9.9 times out of 10, you're going to get a meaningful signal out of the clustering. So, you're going to say, okay, I've got here, for instance, 100 million tennis balls, and 65 million are green, and 35 million are red. That means something. That clustering actually means something. And based on that meaning, then you can infer other things, and you can deduce other things, which allows you to take that data and basically do something with it. And that essentially is the best definition of what semantic is. You take data, you connect it together, you understand what it means, and once you understand what it means, you take that meaning and you actually use it, whereas in the past you couldn't.
I think that there are, as time goes on, people are going to bubble up through the organization to be able to bring this on, but that ties into my passion, which is helping entrepreneurs and especially helping baby boomers to be able to identify and to pursue their purpose. that they're able to get to the first page and the first rank in Google because they're in there all the time engaging with the crowd, whereas the big companies don't have that kind of interaction with their employees.
That's a very telling remark, actually, because in many ways, semantic search does away with the technical layers of marketing and traditional digital marketing we did in the past. And it breaks completely with the tradition we have had of scaling things and dressing them up, which is where we've been going for the last 200 years. It takes us back to the village square. And if you go back to the pre-industrial age village square, when you get onto the village square and you want to buy something, what do? Well, you go to the person you know, and they probably know you. And because they know you, they're unlikely to give you substandard goods, and they're unlikely to rip you off because they work through word of mouth. So if they do that, they're basically hurting themselves, and they're not really making enough from you to justify their doing so. So they tend to give you the best service possible because it's good for them, and it's also good for you. And here you work in alignment. What is good for them, or rather what is good for you, is also good for them. If you don't know that person, however, what do? You go to somebody whom you do know and you say, listen, what I want to buy is, whatever it is. It could be a new set of horseshoes for your horse, or it could be a brand new sword so you can go and kill your neighbor, for instance. So you say to your friend, where can I get a really good set of horseshoes or a really sharp sword? And, your friend tells you, hey, you go to that person and tell them I send you, and, they're really cool. They'll really help you out. And that's how you did business in the past. And in that setting, really what rose were two things. There's value and quality. Value in terms of what you valued, and quality in terms of what you actually received. And the same things now come into play now on a global level on the web, digitally. So basically, and here's the great leveler. We hoped the internet would have been the great leveler, and it wasn't. But now we get into semantic search, we get into semantic web, and actually that is the great leveler, because when you now have a signal which is unique to you, when you do a search, for instance, and the information you find, the product you find is unique to your search and your particular needs, then what is really important is this transaction which you enter with that person or that company on one-to-one, and what the value of the transaction is to you. So a person who has the quality and they have the word of mouth will actually be able, a small operator will be able to work on as big a stage as the web, as a big company, on the same level now. It doesn't matter if you have a team of 10,000 people doing your bidding, or some guy working from your back bedroom, for instance. What really matters is, can you generate the right social signals? Can you convince your public that you are the real McCoy? Can you consistently deliver value to those you actually transact with? And if the answer is yes to all those things, that's it. You're onto a winner. And it doesn't matter, if you are huge or very small. And that is very empowering. It's also very challenging, obviously, because, as you said, large corporations are not used to working this way. They've been used to throwing money and manpower at problems and thinking, okay, that's all it takes to actually solve them. It doesn't anymore. You've got to go back to the drawing board. You've got to say, is my quality up to standard? Does it meet the expectations of my public? Do I engage with them and let them know that, hey, I value them as customers instead of seeing them as numbers which give me dollars? And these are hard questions to answer. They require a lot of soul searching, which again is not something large corporations get into, even smaller ones, really. It requires a lot of real thinking in terms of their sales teams, in terms of their people, because if you need to connect at that level on the web, then you need to understand, how do you do it? How do you break down your content to get a kind of interaction? How do you present yourself to show that, hey, you are people first and a company second? So that's the kind of thinking that's actually required now at a business level.
Yeah, it's no longer the one with the most resources to be able to win. I mean, one of the things we teach in the class, for instance, is the evolution where where today the consumer is the boss. In the beginning, it was the manufacturer. They were the ones that had the power, they had the scale, and then the distributors, with Walmart being probably the prime example of somebody that was leading it because of their dominance in data and being able to understand what was going on out there in the field. They got the power and accumulated it. And now it's moved to the consumer to be able to find these niche products that people have a passion for and they are willing to engage, it creates a dynamic that's totally different, and it's what the country needs.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And this is the difficulty that most businesses actually face. They know that they need to change. And actually, there's a real disconnect in most businesses because the executives at mid to top level understand that they need to change, but the people actually running the organization or greenlighting the decisions are still fighting the way they used to in the 20th century. And that kind of mindset which exists within most large businesses creates a disconnect, which will take a little bit of time to actually overcome. It even exists within medium-sized businesses. And it's only people who work at a very small level or very small scale or even at an individual level, they actually get the change that's happening and are able to reposition themselves quickly enough to actually take advantage of this. Regardless of that fact, they all face the same problem, which is time. Because you don't go into business in order to become a social media engager or a publisher of content or a photographer of photographs or a meme creator. And these are all activities which you actually have to learn to engage on the web. And this is where it becomes really new and scary because it feels like it's completely outside your control. You think it's completely outside your skill set. In most cases, it's also outside your knowledge, and you're not sure what you're doing. But in terms of businesses, we always been able to engage in activities in the past, which had a very specific goal. And any kind of business is good in creating a line of reasoning, which starts off with an activity, which is supposed to have an intent, and then it has some kind of assessment, which allows you to determine the return on the investment of time that you actually engaged in. Now, these questions don't change. So essentially, any kind of business engaging digitally today and trying to become very personal and very personable and very socially engaging still has to go back to those basic questions. It has to say, what do I do? How do I do it? How do I test it? So I can see what results I get. And if you're not able to actually work out that kind of process, then you are basically wasting time and possibly money. So really, you need to have those three different separate questions linked into a chain, which allows you to assess how effective you are on the web, and what do you do, how do you do it, and how do you test this.
It just seems like there's some opportunities. I keep coming back to what the entrepreneur can do and how individuals, and even if they're inside a company, they must be an entrepreneur. Everybody's, it seems like these days, has got to be looking at themselves as a free agent because they could be independent pretty quickly sometimes the way companies work.
You're right. You have to be creative because it's the only way that you can actually be personable, even if you're within a large corporation. If you go into a job today in a large company and you expect to sit in a cubicle where somebody will actually give you something to do, you do it, at the end of the day, you're going to go home and forget about it. And it's going to be done almost blindly. Well, that kind of job doesn't exist anymore. You need to be able to take full ownership of what you do. You need to understand completely what you have to do. You need to be able to connect with the people around you at a very high networked level. You need to have the communication skills that you need within the organization to actually have free flow of information within it, so that you're constantly being enriched by your own views in terms of what's happening internally. And then, and only then, do you stand a chance of actually fighting successfully outside it and trying to target the audience, which is shifting and evolving really quickly.
While it may be scary for some big companies to be able to jump in and bite off Google Semantic Search and Google Plus using that as the platform, the interesting thing might be as a strategy for companies is to encourage their employees to take a little bit of time every day to get into Google Plus, show them how to do it, train them. I mean, get guys like the Hangout helper there who's got a good course called Hangout Mastery that can really help people utilize these tools at a good level and quickly get up to speed. The possibility of being able to come back into the company and influence the company upwards to be able to do some things, it just seems like there's some opportunities. David, I appreciate so much your coming here. I mean, we're getting to the end of the hour, and it's really been impressive. I mean, I know that the students that I can't wait to get back in there. We've got 2.5 more hours, 3 more hours
Okay.
of teaching to go, so I'll be back there going into some of the things on research and about evaluating of the internal as well as the competition and external factors.
On that note, any questions which come up during the lesson or any subsequent questions, I'll quite happily answer. So there's no problem.